power bills for most Mainers are spiking to start the new year.
And when you're paying bills like we are, you have to cut back where you can.
3 Central Maine Power customers from across the state desperately trying to lower their skyrocketing bills.
Turns out he called Central Maine Power. When his bill came, it was a whopping $1,800.
In 2023, the citizens of Maine went to the polls to vote in a referendum on a rather dramatic proposition. The question was whether to replace the state's 2 largest utility companies, Central Maine Power and Versant, who have a monopoly in the state, with a new company, Pine Tree Power, that would be owned by the government and run by a community-appointed board of directors. It was the culmination of years of anger and frustration towards CMP and Versant, but it wasn't always that way. So, what went wrong? As with so many of these stories, it's a case of profit over people, as the complicated interests of energy companies, environmentalists, concerned citizens, ethics watchdogs, and courts converged on the state of Maine, as not just the states, but the world's energy power brokers battled for control. Central Maine Power began as just about every other major utility company in North America. In 1899, 2 men bought the Oakland Power Company, which was a glorified name for a generator strapped to a water wheel, which provided power for the nearby village. Over the following decades, through smart business decisions, ruthlessness, innovation, and questionable funding sources, CMP thrived, buying up just about all of their competitors. CMP has long adopted a strategy of influencing public opinion and potential laws through expensive and aggressive lobbying. In the 1920s, one of CMP's founders threatened to stop construction on a massive hydroelectric dam project if the government didn't repeal a law forbidding the export of Maine's power out of state. In the 80s, as they expanded into nuclear power, CMP and other utility companies spent millions of dollars lobbying against 3 separate referendums, voting on whether to close Maine Yankee, a nuclear power plant in Maine owned primarily by CMP. All 3 referendums voted to keep the plant open, but it was eventually closed in the 90s due to an investigation that did find environmental and safety concerns, and significantly higher rates of cancer in neighboring towns. Throughout the 2000s, CMP went through a number of mergers and sales, eventually ending up as a private company primarily owned by Spanish energy company Iberdrola, as part of a group of energy companies called Avangrid. People in Maine were largely optimistic. Maine is an expensive state to deliver energy in, and many hoped Iberdrola would have the deep pockets to invest in infrastructure improvements that CMP couldn't afford on its own. And they did invest. They invested in something called the Maine Power Reliability Program, or MPRP, the largest infrastructure investment in Maine's history at the time, costing $1.4 billion and building hundreds of miles of new transmission lines and 5 substations, with the cost primarily being passed on to ratepayers. The MPRP increased CMP's profitability by at least $175 million annually. The project completed on time in 2015 with very little public resistance. At the time, CMP had a great reputation, but just a few months later, events would converge to call all of that into question. The day before Halloween, 2017 marked 2 separate things improbably taking place at the same time. The first, a massive windstorm battered Maine, bringing nearly hurricane-level winds and knocking out power for around 500,000 people, more than half the state. 404,000 of those were in CMP territory. The second is CMP rolled out a long-delayed new billing system called SmartCare that was a huge update to their previous billing system that was created in the 70s. More on that in a moment. By numbers, the 2017 storm was the largest power outage in Maine's history. But it wasn't the outage itself that was necessarily the issue, but CMP's response. 5 days later, 100,000 people were still without power. Some households and businesses waited 10 days for their power to be restored. CMP's customer service line wasn't answering calls, and their website gave infrequent updates that were often incorrect. None of the newly constructed lines that were part of the MPRP failed. The outage was a result of roadside lines going down due to fallen trees and the like, which raised questions about whether the MPRP was the best investment, if it didn't prevent power from going down or allow it to be restored in a timely manner. And while hundreds of thousands of Mainers were in the dark, they were also about to foot the bill for the repairs. CMP's rates include $10 million in reserve funds for storm recovery. Based on a law passed in 2014, in the case of extraordinary storms, recovery costs are shared 50-50, between shareholders and ratepayers. But CMP can only pay a maximum of $3 million per year and $2 million per storm. In the end, ratepayers were on the hook for $13 million in recovery costs for the storm, in addition to the $10 million they had already paid as part of their normal rates that went into CMP's reserve funds. The Maine Public Utilities Commission investigated CMP's performance and said that they were adequately prepared for the storm and had responded reasonably. And maybe that's true, but damage had already been done to CMP's reputation. Customers, by and large, didn't feel they had responded quickly or had been adequately prepared, and the rulings of the PUC, the state's regulator, were met with some incredulity of their own. At the time of that investigation, 2 of the 3 commissioners on the PUC were appointed by the governor, Paul LePage. LePage was a vocal critic of renewable energy, blaming it and deregulation for high energy prices in Maine. He was also a big supporter of CMP and received money from lobbying groups funded by the utility company. Emails obtained through a Freedom of Information Act reveal that commissioners within the PUC thought the organization was being politicized, used as an arm of the government, and that submitted applications were not being reviewed on their merit but based on political criteria. At the time, CMP was routinely lobbying the government, paying into LePage's PAC and sponsoring Republican events, days after Republican lawmakers testified in alignment with CMP's goals in front of regulators. CMP gained access to a private reception at an event with prominent Republican lawmakers. The next day, Republicans mounted opposition to a pro-rooftop solar bill, despite many of those same lawmakers having previously supported it. In general, consumers were becoming more aware of CMP's involvement in state politics and their potential indirect influence on the regulator who was intended to keep them in check. But even as they did damage control after the storm, the second of the October 30th events was beginning to be noticed. The rollout of smart care was long anticipated. CMP had started installing smart meters in 2010 that were supposed to allow customers to see their usage in real time, helping them to save money. But without a digital ecosystem to do that in, the only cost savings that came from the smart meters went to CMP, as they were able to lay off 85 meter readers. The storm impacted all of New England and was followed up by uncharacteristically cold winter weather. So when almost immediately customers in Maine started reporting bills 50% higher than the same period a year earlier, CMP had a logical explanation. The cost of supplying electricity had gone up due to the storm, and customers were using more electricity since the weather was colder than usual. But that didn't explain all of the issues. Some customers received no bills at all, and when they finally did receive them, all at once months later, they couldn't afford them. When customers complained to CMP, they were brushed off with a series of increasingly bizarre explanations, from faulty appliances to teens playing too many video games. The PUC began an audit to get to the bottom of the billing issues, but it couldn't find the answer, and concluded that neither the meters nor the billing systems were at fault. The audit cost $400,000 and was paid for by ratepayers. But further investigation found a series of mistakes and poor decisions surrounding the rollout of SmartCare. They had set an original rollout date of June 2017, but after failing to meet deadlines repeatedly, CMP was facing a $1.5 million fine from the PUC for excessive delays. Under increased pressure from higher-ups at Iberdrola, the company began to cut corners in order to rush the program out. By October 29th, the day before the launch, CMP had skipped 13 weeks of testing on SmartCare and failed to fix around 100 system defects, not to mention dozens more they hadn't even detected. Interestingly, almost exactly the same thing had happened at another Iberdrola-owned energy company, Scottish Power, just a few years earlier. But the problems didn't stop at pre-launch. CMP was underprepared for customer complaints due to heavy layoffs. By the end of 2019, CMP had apologized for its customer service response, but not for the billing errors, and customers were still receiving bills they couldn't explain, though in smaller numbers. By that point, 2 separate audits had found that the smart meters were giving accurate bills and had concluded the issue really was higher usage from a cold snap. Meanwhile, citizens in Maine were having to choose between paying their electricity bills or their rent. Some went bankrupt, or started only showering at the community center. Although CMP was ready to move on, customers and the PUC were not. In 2020, the PUC slapped CMP with a $9.9 million penalty, the largest in recent history, for poor customer service and mishandling the implementation of their new billing system. This is in addition to over $5 million in credits and refunds CMP was ordered to issue to customers who filed verified complaints. The penalty required that CMP meet a certain level of customer service standards over 18 months or face further penalties. This penalty was paid by lowering customer rates. Yet at the same time, the regulator agreed that CMP was entitled to a rate hike to pay for grid improvements and to hire more staff to improve their customer service. The end result, between the penalty and the rate hike, was about a 2% increase to customer bills. Throughout all this time, internal documents suggest CMP was hardly focused on the scandal at all. Because they have a monopoly, there's nowhere for customers to go, and fixing their billing system doesn't make them money. There was another project that had their full attention, one that did promise to be highly profitable. In 2016, Massachusetts was looking for long-term contracts for renewable energy. They found a partner in Hydro-Quebec, who's one of the largest producers of hydroelectric power in North America. To get that power, Massachusetts would need to construct transmission lines from Quebec through Maine. They put out an RFP, and in 2018, CMP officially won the bid to build the transmission lines in Maine. The majority of the lines were to be retrofitted to existing poles, but a new 53-mile corridor would need to be constructed. And that corridor became the subject of hundreds of millions of dollars of lobbying, years of court cases, referendums, and political battles. CMP initially began seeking approvals for the project in 2016. The government was on their side. After all, the corridor was projected to bring in $1.4 billion of economic benefits to Maine over 15 years, as well as creating thousands of jobs during its construction. For the companies involved, it was also highly lucrative. Hydro-Quebec was projected to make $500 million in its first year, CMP would make $120 million in their first year, as well as $2.9 billion over 20 years for building and operating the lines. But between 2016 and 2019, when construction was set to begin, as you now know, a lot of things changed in regards to CMP's public standing. It's still unclear to what extent the public backlash against the corridor was because of the corridor itself or because of public distrust of CMP and Iberdrola. But the result is the same. A vocal opposition sprang up against the project. Their platform was that the corridor would disrupt important environments and tourism by cutting a 53-mile, 150-foot wide section out of Maine's wilderness, that the project would only create about 40 jobs a year after its completion, and that the clean power it would provide to New England was already being used in Ontario and New York, meaning that they would need to replace that power with fossil fuels, resulting in no actual overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Those in favor of the corridor said basically the opposite on each of those points. It's impossible to know if either side is telling the truth because no independent study has ever been completed on the benefits or issues with the corridor that wasn't paid for by an organization with a vested interest in the outcome. CMP responded as they have often done, with overwhelming financial force. CMP and Avangrid employed lobbyists to help prevent the passing of 3 bills in the legislature, one that would require a more detailed environmental assessment of the project, and others that would have given the citizens of Maine more say in the corridor route. In January of 2021, CMP had all the required paperwork and were given the go-ahead to start building. But in August 2021, a judge ruled against a permit and brought the project to a halt. Back in 2014, CMP was issued a permit for an unrelated project that allowed them to build some transmission lines in Kennebec County, the same approximate area where the corridor was going to be built. Later, the Bureau of Parks and Land amended that same lease to include the land needed for the corridor and also to substantially increase CMP's lease payments. But the judge ruled that this was beyond the director of the Bureau of Parks and Land's authority, as a law passed in the 90s required leases that substantially alter the land to be approved by a 2/3 majority in the legislature. But the legislature didn't even know this lease had been signed until afterwards, something that an investigation later found was deliberate on the part of the governor. Avangrid appealed, but as all of that was working its way through the courts, environmental groups gathered enough signatures to put a question on a referendum, deciding whether or not to overturn the PUC's decision to greenlight the corridor, despite environmental concerns. CMP's lobbying group, Clean Energy Matters, challenged the ruling in court, saying it was unconstitutional, and won. The ruling said that allowing citizens to reverse the PUC's decision would undermine the authority given to them by the legislature. Instead, in November of that year, Mainers voted on whether or not to retroactively ban the construction of high-impact electric transmission lines in Upper Kennebec region. It was the most expensive referendum in the state's history. Over $100 million was spent on both sides. CMP and Avangrid funneled about $11.3 million into Clean Energy Matters, breaking Maine's record for spending by a single group on one side of a referendum. Clean Energy Matters spent tens of thousands of dollars on social media ads, robocall campaigns, town halls, and other initiatives to push the value of the corridor to Mainers. But it wasn't enough. The voters of Maine decided to retroactively ban construction and to require a 2/3 vote of each state legislative chamber to approve high-impact electric transmission line projects using public land. At that point, CMP had already spent almost $450 million on the project and cleared 124 miles of the corridor. But it seemed the project was dead. And while it's tempting here to say this is an instance of David versus Goliath, of environmentalists and grassroots organizations taking down a wealthy multinational corporation, it's not nearly so simple. CMP, it turns out, wasn't the only one who was using huge sums of money to push their agenda. The other side, consisting largely of the organizations Stop the Corridor and Alpine Initiatives, had received millions of dollars, especially leading up to the referendum, which they used to influence public opinion. Yet the source of their funding was unknown, and they planned to keep it that way. However, the Maine Ethics Commission opened a probe that lasted more than 2 years and finally revealed where the money was coming from. NextEra Energy owns the Seabrook nuclear plant in New Hampshire, a state that had rejected a very similar transmission corridor project, and stood to lose tens of millions of dollars a year if the corridor is completed. In 2018, they funded Alpine Initiatives to give a $150,000 donation to the Maine Democratic Party just prior to the election. The next year, they heavily funded Stop the Corridor to organize the 2020 referendum, the one that the Supreme Court ruled was unconstitutional. By the 2021 referendum, their involvement had been made public, but it took years to reveal the extent of the funding they had provided. And although it seemed the project was dead, CMP had one last avenue. Avangrid sued the state of Maine, saying that they had vested interests in the project. Essentially, since they were already $450 million into construction, they had made too much progress for the state to have the right to tell them to stop. A jury ruled unanimously that CMP had acted in good faith and had vested rights in the project, exempting them from the results of the referendum. Today, construction has continued on the corridor, and it seems that the opposition has exhausted all avenues of stopping it. But the controversy remains. On one hand, the people of Maine soundly voted to stop it, but the turnout for that vote was only about 37%. And it was heavily influenced not only by CMP's lobbying, but by out-of-state companies as well. But the whole corridor campaign, which many in Maine feel has been forced through by corporate interests and government lobbying, has cemented the deep feelings of distrust and anger towards CMP among large portions of their customers. In 2021, CMP ranked dead last in customer service rankings for J.D. Power. Throughout those years, an idea grew within the people of Maine and members of the government. The idea was to replace CMP and Versant with a publicly owned and operated utilities company. It was even given a name, Pine Tree Power, a callback to CMP's old logo before it was bought by Iberdrola. By 2023, it had received enough support to go to a referendum. The people of Maine would vote on whether to get rid of the company at the center of so much controversy and complaints over the last decade. Opponents said that the cost and time required for the new entity to acquire all of CMP and Versant's assets would far outweigh the savings that Pine Tree Power would provide. Proponents said it would lower rates and save Mainers money in the long run. Despite all that, as the referendum approached, the pro-Pine Tree side simply couldn't get any momentum. They fell far behind their funding goals, unable to launch any TV ads and relying primarily on organic press coverage and a small spattering of celebrity endorsements. On the other side, money flowed freely. In 2023, CMP and Versant's lobbying arms outspent the pro-Pine Tree agencies by 44 times. Collectively, they spent over $32 million to try and defeat the referendum. That included ads and endorsements, as well as paying a number of former Maine politicians to speak in their favor, including politicians who were heavily critical of the utility companies during their time in office. The referendum became the second most expensive in Maine history, only because one side hardly raised any money at all. In the end, the pro-Pine Tree side simply didn't have the finances to deliver a compelling message that their option was better than the status quo, while CMP and Versant laid out a frightening path forward, where transitioning to Pine Tree would cost the citizens of Maine $13.5 billion, delay the fight against climate change, raise rates, and with no guarantee of better long-term outcomes. The resolution was voted down, 70-30. CMP and Versant would remain. Since then, a few things have changed. Regulators in Maine voted to allow Iberdrola to acquire all remaining shares of Avangrid without a review, meaning that CMP is now 100% owned by the Spanish giant. Perhaps the biggest change is a law passed in 2024 that prohibits utilities from billing ratepayers for spending on advertising, lobbying, and political expenses, and requires them to declare spending disclosures to the state. CMP has said it uses shareholder, not ratepayer money in its lobbying efforts. Still, over 100,000 households in Maine are struggling to pay their utility bills as of 2024, as energy prices in the state are much higher than the national average. Mainers experience some of the longest and most frequent power outages in the country, even as CMP continues to ask for rate hikes to improve infrastructure. Across the country, Avangrid and Iberdrola are becoming known for customer service issues and reliability problems. But now, as CMP is 100% owned by Iberdrola, and the voters of Maine have upheld their utilities monopoly, the only remaining incentive is to maximize profit.